So welcome everyone to the second Student Psychedelic Conference. We've got a team of organisers behind us, the Student Psychedelic Conference Committee, and this is made up of students from Drug Science Student Society, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, and the Southampton Psychedelic Research Society. And we've had a lot of support from Drug Science putting on this conference as well. We're really glad you guys are all here, and we thank you a lot for all of your support. Just to introduce myself, my name is Nadia Barakat, and my pronouns are she, her. And yeah, so our first panel today, we have the wonderful Chris Letheby and Jussi Vilka, and it is psychedelics, the philosophy and psychedelics, sorry. Just to introduce both speakers a little bit, Chris Letheby is a philosopher of the mind, and he works on issues related to the therapeutic and transformative potential of psychedelic drugs. He's currently a philosopher at the University of Western Australia and a postdoc researcher at the University of Adelaide. And Jussi Vilka is a philosopher and psychologist working at the Faculty of Arts, Psychology and Theology at Abo Akademi University in Finland, with a PhD in both philosophy and psychology. He also coordinates the multidisciplinary network for psychedelic research in Finland. I won't go into much more about what their research is in, because I'm sure they're going to talk a lot about this. So without further ado, I'll pass on to Chris Letheby to tell us a little bit about the philosophy and psychedelics.
All right, thanks very much, Nadia. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm going to try and share my slides now. Okay, can everyone see the slideshow all right? Good, thanks, Jussi. All right, so from the beginning, so the talk is called Psychedelic Epistemology, and I gather it's supposed to go for about 15 minutes. So if someone could tell me if I'm about to run out of time, you know, maybe give me a warning when I've got 2 or 3 minutes left, that would be great. So one question that, of course, is discussed a lot these days about classic serotonergic psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, and so on, is can they act as safe and effective psychiatric treatments? So in conjunction with psychotherapy, can they be used as safe and effective treatments for anxiety disorders, for depression, for various forms of addiction? And of course, it's this question and the potential for an affirmative answer to it that's sort of driving so much of the interest and, you know, public interest, research interest, medical interest, and funding and so on for psychedelic research at the moment. But there's another question which tends to get discussed, or at least recently has been discussed less than this one, but is perhaps equally interesting and equally important, and that is, can we gain knowledge through the use of classic psychedelics? You know, can individuals who take psychedelics and have psychedelic experiences gain some kind of interesting or important knowledge in this way? And so, of course, many people who take psychedelics do report epistemic benefits, right? So knowledge-related benefits in the philosophical jargon. And so there's a real question here about, are these reports accurate? You know, are people actually kind of improving their ability to gain knowledge of the world and to form true beliefs or accurate perceptions of reality through taking psychedelic drugs? Or on the other hand, are psychedelics just inducing false insights, you know, apparent insights that feel convincing but aren't in fact genuine? And so in this case, the use of psychedelics would be epistemically harmful. It would be detrimental to people's efforts to acquire knowledge and to know what reality is really like. So this is one area where, it's not the only area, but it's one important area where philosophy, the discipline of academic philosophy, can make a significant contribution to the psychedelic renaissance. And so one of the sort of, at least in the Western tradition, it's considered as one of the 4 kind of major central subfields of philosophy is epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge. And so epistemology itself, of course, is not confined to Western philosophy. It goes back millennia across many different philosophical traditions. And so thousands of years of inquiry into the nature of knowledge, you know, what knowledge is, the conditions of its acquisition, the obstacles to its acquisition, and so on, have produced extremely useful conceptual frameworks, critical tools, argumentative tools. And so my main suggestion is that we can use these kind of intellectual tools from epistemology, the philosophical study of knowledge, in order to make progress in tackling this question about the epistemic status of psychedelic-induced experiences. So in this talk, I'm just going to give a brief overview, very kind of selective and sketchy overview of the emerging area of inquiry that is psychedelic epistemology, you know, the philosophical study of the epistemic status and the epistemic properties of the psychedelic experience. And just to note again, I am confining myself solely to classic serotonergic psychedelics here, even though probably at least some of what I say might be able to generalize to other types of substances as well. So one type of knowledge that people very often claim to have gained from psychedelic experiences and sincerely believe that they have gained from psychedelic experiences is metaphysical knowledge. And I'm not going to define exactly what I mean by that. I'm just going to give some examples so you'll know the kind of thing I'm talking about. You might hear a bit more about metaphysical knowledge from Jussi later, I'm not sure. But the kind of thing I'm talking about here is when people claim to have gained direct knowledge about what reality is really like at its most basic, ultimate, or fundamental level. You know, when people have mystical or mystical type experiences and claim to have gained direct knowledge of the existence of a cosmic consciousness, a divine ground of being, some kind of spirit world or world of kind of disembodied or discarnate entities or whatever. And so the late eminent religious scholar Houston Smith said the central message of the entheogens is that there is another reality, capital R, that puts this one in the shade. And so this is a very pithy expression of this view that, you know, high dose psychedelic use under conducive conditions can lead to the acquisition of knowledge about, you know, the metaphysical nature of reality or what reality is really like. So the question is, you know, is this real knowledge that people are gaining, or is it kind of merely apparent knowledge? Is it something masquerading as knowledge that actually is a false belief? And so, you know, it depends, among other things, on whether there really is another reality that puts this one in the shade, whether there really is a cosmic consciousness, a divine ground of being, or whatever. And of course, if there is, then people may well be gaining genuine epistemic benefits here. There are still other questions to address, I want to note. You know, even if people are gaining true beliefs out of these experiences, it doesn't necessarily follow that they're gaining knowledge. But if there really is something like what Houston Smith is talking about, then it's possible that this sort of thing is a genuine epistemic benefit of psychedelic ingestion. But the question I've tended to focus on, because cards on the table, I don't think there is such a thing. So I've tended to focus on the question, what if there's not, right? What if there is no cosmic consciousness, no ground of being, no spirit world? What then? You know, what would be the implications of that for the epistemic credentials of psychedelic use and for the overall epistemic status of the psychedelic experience? So, as I say, I've been trying to evaluate the epistemic status, particularly of sort of therapeutic and transformative, you know, medium to high dose psychedelic experiences within a particular philosophical framework, which is a worldview that's known as metaphysical naturalism. Of course, some people think this is not the best name for this view. Nonetheless, it's a name that gets used a lot. And it's a worldview that is closely related to other views like physicalism or materialism. It's a worldview that essentially says the natural world is all there is. The mind, including conscious experience, is somehow a product of the brain or something that occurs within the brain. And essentially, there is no other reality that puts this one in the shade. There is no divine ground of being, no spirit world, no cosmic consciousness. And so one of the main things I've tried to argue is that even from such a naturalist, physicalist, or materialist perspective, transformative psychedelic experiences may still have significant epistemic benefits. And I think, as I said, that concepts developed in epistemology can help us to identify and to articulate these benefits. And so there is a three-way distinction that often gets made, especially in Anglophone epistemology, you know, epistemology in the English-speaking world from the last 100 years or so, between knowledge that, knowledge how, and knowledge by acquaintance. And I think each of these concepts identifies a type of epistemic benefit that may well be gained from these kinds of psychedelic experiences. So I'm going to go through them now. Spoiler, I think knowledge how and knowledge by acquaintance are more promising than knowledge that. Knowledge that, there are definitely some unresolved issues there as to whether that sort of thing really does get gained in these experiences. So I'll just go through the kind of obvious candidates within these three categories one by one. So the first one I mentioned was knowledge that, right, which is also known as propositional knowledge. And this is basically the kind of knowledge we have when we know certain facts, you know, so knowing that Paris is the capital of France. This is kind of a paradigm instance of propositional knowledge. And one sort of basic working definition of propositional knowledge is that it's justified true belief, right? I mean, virtually all philosophers in this area agree that this is not quite enough. You know, there are problems with this definition, but it sort of gets at the general idea. The idea is that if you have propositional knowledge, you have a belief about the world, right? So you believe, say, that Paris is the capital of France. The belief has to be true. The idea is you can't know something that isn't actually the case. But mere true belief is not enough, right? Because the thought is you can have a belief that's true just accidentally or by luck or by coincidence. And in those kinds of cases, we don't say that you really have knowledge. So the idea is that to have propositional knowledge, you've got to have a true belief plus some extra factor, which is often referred to as justification, right? So one way of understanding that is you've got to have sufficient evidence or sufficient reasons for holding the belief. So the question is, can we gain knowledge of this kind? Do people routinely gain knowledge of this kind through psychedelic experiences? And I think if we're ruling out metaphysical knowledge, you know, things like the existence of a cosmic consciousness or whatever, the most obvious possibility is psychodynamic insight, right? So very often people who have psychedelic experiences report apparent insights into their own minds. In particular, they report discovering new facts that they didn't know previously about their own mental states, about their own previously unconscious beliefs, desires, repressed memories, and so on. And I think there's no doubt whatsoever that people do have apparent insights of this kind. But there is a difficulty, right? Oh, there are a couple of difficulties, actually. And one is, you know, is the truth criterion satisfied? Are the insights of this kind that people have under psychedelics typically accurate? Or are they instead sort of what David Jopling has referred to as placebo insights? So there's a lot of evidence that, you know, people can recover false memories. People can have apparent memory recovery experiences where the memories in question are not accurate, are not veridical. And the mere fact that an apparent psychodynamic insight has some kind of therapeutic benefit, and the mere fact that it kind of is accompanied by this strong feeling of certainty, none of these things on their own are sufficient evidence that the insight is actually accurate, right? It could also be some kind of confabulation. And this is what Jopling is pointing out with this concept of placebo insights. So there is this difficulty, and it's very hard to know how to actually resolve it, right? I mean, what sort of independent evidence can you appeal to try and figure out whether the insights people are having about their own psyche are accurate? I think there's possibly work that can be done there, right? I mean, I think there are, you know, we can kind of try and that question that I just asked wasn't merely rhetorical. We can sort of put some thought into it and try and figure out how we might actually address this empirically. But from a philosophical standpoint, these are some of the difficulties that arise, right? First of all, are the insights typically true? Second, even if they are true, is there justification? You know, does having an apparent insight in a psychedelic state constitute good evidence or good reason for thinking that you really did previously have this belief or desire, or that this event really did happen to you? Again, I'm not kind of offering a particular answer. I'm just saying these are some of the questions that would need to be addressed in order to establish that psychedelic use really can lead to the acquisition of propositional knowledge about one's own mind. So let's move on then. Let's look at the other two remaining candidates. So the second type of knowledge I mentioned is what's called knowledge how, or ability knowledge. And this is the kind of knowledge that we have when we know how to do something. So we know how to ride a bicycle, or we know how to program a computer, or something like this. And this is perhaps less obvious, but there definitely are some reports from patients in psychedelic therapy and from people, you know, healthy volunteers who have taken psychedelics as well, that suggest the idea of learning how to do something through these experiences, gaining some kind of psychological skill. And so here's one report from a patient in a trial of psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, where the language is very explicit. You know, the phrase know how is actually there. And so this person says, I saw negative patterns in my life where if something bad happens, I used to just put it to the back of my mind. Afterwards, I allowed myself to experience everything, even if it is sadness. Now I know how to deal with my feelings rather than repress them. So there's a very explicit claim there that through a psychedelic induced experience, someone has gained some kind of ability knowledge, you know, someone now knows how to do something that they didn't know how to do before. What is it that they are claiming to know how to do? Well, to deal with their feelings rather than repress them, you know, to relate to their own thoughts and emotions, to their own kind of physical, mental, and emotional states in a way that is healthy, productive, open, accepting, and so on. And this one, I think we can be fairly confident in because there's actually good psychometric evidence. You know, it's not just the first person reports, but we now have all these studies showing that a single psychedelic experience can durably increase mindfulness related capacities. So capacities for being aware of one's thoughts and feelings and relating to them in these specific kinds of ways that are cultivated in mindfulness meditation. And similarly, there are studies showing increases in the construct of psychological flexibility after a psychedelic experience. And this is a construct that, again, is very closely related to mindfulness skills. So there's more, obviously, I can say about that in the discussion if people are interested, but I think this is a very promising candidate. I think we've got enough evidence to say that very often people do gain some sort of ability knowledge from their, you know, high dose therapeutic transformative psychedelic experiences. So that's the second candidate. The third, and I'm having a, here we go. It's just having a slide switching issue for a moment there. So the third and final candidate that I want to talk about is knowledge by acquaintance or acquaintance knowledge. And this one is a little less straightforward conceptually than the other two. So what is acquaintance knowledge? I mean, one way of thinking about it is that it's the kind of knowledge we have when we know someone, right? We're acquainted with them as opposed to knowing some fact or knowing how to do something. But in fact, knowledge by acquaintance is not usually reserved in epistemology for talking about our knowledge of people. Instead, what the concept is kind of trying to express or trying to get at, and the term knowledge by acquaintance goes back to Bertrand Russell in the early 20th century. And the idea is knowing something in the most direct way possible, right? So being kind of directly or more or less directly acquainted with something rather than knowing about it indirectly through some kind of inference, testimony, book learning, or whatever. And so Russell himself had a very strong view of what this amounts to. You know, he thought that there were some things we could be really directly acquainted with, you know, no sort of mediation between the mind and the object of knowledge. But there are some reasons to be suspicious about whether that is really the case. So I just kind of adopt a more minimal definition from the philosopher Earl Coney, which is that knowledge by acquaintance is the kind of knowledge you have when you know something in the most direct way that it's possible for you to know that thing. And so, as I said, the relevant contrast there is with mere kind of indirect or inferential knowledge that you can get through book learning or through other people's testimony or whatever. And so my thought is there are certain facts about the human mind, about one's own mind in particular, that are quite easy to know indirectly. And so two candidates are that, you know, the mind has vast potential that typically goes unrealized in the ordinary sober default waking state of consciousness. And secondly, that the ordinary sense of self, which feels so kind of solid and real and immutable in the normal course of things, is actually contingent, is mutable, is highly constructed, right? So these are things you can know by reading trip reports on Erowid, or by reading some neuroscience or philosophy, or, you know, the mystical literature of the world's religions. You can come to have this sort of propositional belief, this indirect knowledge that, you know, my mind has this potential for kind of mystical states of harmony and wonder and awe and, you know, feelings of unity and connectedness and so on. And you can come to have this propositional belief that, you know, my ordinary sense of being a self or an I separate from everything else is optional. You know, it's a contingent feature of my consciousness that is somehow constructed and doesn't have to be there. But it's much harder to have direct or sort of more or less immediate knowledge of these facts about one's mind. And I think psychedelic use is one of the most direct, powerful, and efficient ways of catalyzing this, of allowing people to come face to face, if you will, with these facts about their mind, rather than just inferring them based on the testimony of others. So Here's a quote from Walter Pahnke in the 1960s. He says, at this point, at the point at which a kind of complete mystical experience emerges, the patient becomes intensely aware of completely new dimensions of experience which he might never before have imagined possible. From his own personal experience, he now knows that there is more to the potential range of human consciousness than we ordinarily realize. This profound and awe-inspiring insight can transform attitudes and behavior. And so in a similar vein, you have a healthy volunteer in a study in the 60s who received mescaline and said afterwards that he thought the single most important outcome of his experience was the knowledge and certainty he now has that it's truly possible to attain to a sense of harmony with all creatures and things. So the idea is that before this experience, he may have had the belief that it's possible for him to attain to this sense of harmony. It may even have been justified true belief. He may have had propositional knowledge about the unrealized potential of his mind. But the mescaline experience, in my view, allowed him to gain knowledge by acquaintance, allowed him to become familiar with that fact about his mind in the most direct way possible, which is, of course, for that very potential to become manifest in that very mind itself. So that's essentially what I have to say. I think there are other possible epistemic benefits of psychedelic experiences, even within the sort of naturalist, physicalist, or materialist framework that I adopt. But those are the three main ones that I thought were important to mention in the time frame. So I'll leave it there, and then we can talk about others in the discussion later if people are interested. All right, thanks.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Chris. I'll pass over now to Jussi. You can start your presentation.
Thank you so much. I think that was an excellent example of what good analytic philosophy can be at its best. Can you see my slides now?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So I just try to see you as well. I would like to see you. Let's see where you are. Well, maybe I just settle with this. Yes, my topic is naturalism and mysticism in psychedelic science. And I'm a philosopher and psychologist at Åbo Academy. So there is a tension between this kind of mysticism and naturalism in psychedelic science. The naturalists, this is a bit like an exaggeration, but you get what I mean. The naturalists think that mystical or metaphysical insights are negative side effects of psychedelic experiences. And Sanders and Tillmans call them the elephant in the living room of psychedelic science. And they call for demystification and naturalization of psychedelic science, where we wouldn't make reference to spiritual entities or anything like that. And then on the other hand, we have this more mystically oriented approach advocated, for example, by Bill Richards, who is a psychologist. He has a book titled Sacred Knowledge, which tells everything. And these people would consider psychedelic insights as very veridical insights about the fundamental nature of reality. And currently, for example, Peter Sjöstedt Hughes is advocating this kind of approach. He's a philosopher. And this is like related to the, or part of the entheogenic conception of psychedelics, where it is held that psychedelics can reveal the God within. Literally, it means that. And more specifically, as most people know, Chris has formulated this argument against metaphysical insights, saying that they are incompatible with naturalism. This is motivated by Pollan's question with the journalist, whether psychedelic therapy is simply foisting a comforting delusion on the sick and dying. So are these metaphysical insights incompatible with naturalism? And I focus on metaphysical insights, by which I mean insights about the fundamental nature of reality. So the structure is, what are the metaphysical insights? And second, what is naturalism? And in particular, how does it deal with consciousness? That's important. And then are the metaphysical insights compatible with naturalism? This is a really wide topic, so I try to be summarize a lot. I will not go very deep into anything. So metaphysical insights in current psychedelic science, these come from Walter Stacy's work. He was a philosopher of mysticism. These are from the book Philosophy and Mysticism from '61. And he identified 7 key features of the mystical experience based on his like examination of historical mystics throughout cultures and throughout ages. And he ended up with these 7 core features that you see here. And I think these 3 are most important from this metaphysical perspective. The experience that all is one, or experiencing something non-spatial and non-temporal, which also entails that it's beyond the sensory reality, which is spatial and temporal. And it has a sense of objectivity, or what James calls noetic quality. So this is important because if an insight is not considered as true, then it's not a metaphysical insight, really. So when people have, for example, a hallucination of an elf dancing on the table, that's not a metaphysical insight because they know it's not real. But metaphysical insights are considered as really real. And from this evolved the mystical experience questionnaire. Nowadays, MEQ 30 is the commonly used, and it includes, for example, these items, questions. These are like directly from the questionnaire, which relate to metaphysical insights or metaphysics. Experience of pure being and pure awareness beyond the world of sense impressions. So this is what Chris also referred to. Experience of unity with the ultimate reality, and experience that all is one. And then this kind of panpsychist idea that one sees the awareness or the living presence in all things. So to summarize, what is most important in a metaphysical insight, in my opinion, is the insight there is a fundamentally unitary nature of reality that is beyond sense impressions. And in mystical experience, one has met or seen or has become one with this ultimate nature. And the content of this ultimate nature is usually described vaguely in metaphors as light, mind, or God, for example, or it's also considered as ineffable. And these are just like poor conceptualizations of what really took place or what was encountered. So what is naturalism then? There are 2 components. Generally, Papineau makes this, and many other entries, dictionary entries, for example, make this, that there is an ontological component, which usually is taken to mean that everything is physical. The nature is all physical. And then there is the epistemological component, roughly that ways of knowing reality should be compatible with science. And I emphasize, this is also like quite commonly accepted, that of course the naturalist doesn't want to say that the only way of knowing reality would be through science, because this is what is happening right here now. It's not science, but I know that you are there listening, and at least that there's a computer on the table. So we don't want to say that science is the only way to know reality. Of course, there are many ways to know the same reality. But I take it that the naturalism, as commonly conceived, is problematic when we consider consciousness, because the hard problem of consciousness is also the hard problem of naturalism. So if all is physical, then what is the place of consciousness? And why can't we infer from science what experiences feel like or what they are? You know, for example, Frank Jackson's Mary thought experiment, or I made in this book, Mary on acid thought experiment. Mary is a neuroscientist of psychedelics, and she knows everything about psychedelic experiences, but she has never taken a psychedelic substance herself. So does she learn something new when she has the experience? So this is basically the same question as Chris had, but from a bit different perspective. This basically just shows that we can't know what consciousness feels like. We can't know what a psychedelic trip feels like before trying it personally. And I think that this is general point. This is not related to just psychedelics, of course. This is related to everything. That I cannot know what it's like to be a bat if I even if I knew everything about bats. So I think this shows the limits of science, and this can be put in the form of an argument. The first premise is that consciousness is physical. We have plenty of evidence for this, both empirical and philosophical evidence. I assume that that is correct. And the second premise is that there are facts about consciousness, namely what experiences feel like, or the subjective character, the phenomenal character, that science cannot convey. So therefore, there are facts about the physical reality that science cannot convey. So science is somehow ignorant about certain aspects of reality, or cannot convey everything there is to know about reality. And so there are theories of this gap. Galen Strawson said that consciousness isn't a mystery, it's matter that is mystery. He was speaking in the context of the hard problem of consciousness. And this Strawson's idea is nowadays usually formulated as Russellian monism, which claims that science can only model relational or extrinsic properties, but not intrinsic properties, and consciousness is intrinsic. For example, Philip Goff advocates this. I think it leads us to like murky analytical metaphysics, which is like problematic. There are problems with Russellian monism, and I think it leads to property dualism, but let's go into that. I think the point is much simpler. We have advocated what we call naturalistic monism, which claims that science is not limited to modeling any specific class of properties. There is only one reality, but science is limited to modeling that reality. So the word is not the object, the map is not the territories. This is the basic point. So what does this mean is that all we have in science and also otherwise is just models of reality. And the models are in consciousness of individual persons, and consciousness cannot know what is outside consciousness. This could be considered as trivial, but I think it's like everything but trivial, because you try to imagine reality outside your consciousness. The moment you try to grasp that reality, you bring it to your consciousness. So it's like it escapes all the time. This resembles some Kant interpretations. So now we get to the compatibility, which I think is the beef of this or the Satan beef. So let's return to this core of the mystical insight. First, there is a fundamental unitary nature of reality that is beyond sense impressions. So this can be reformulated as the claim that we can say that the fundamental nature of reality is the intrinsic nature of reality that is beyond our observations and theories about it. So basically, you there are part of the ultimate nature of reality, and I cannot directly access you because you are there like behind the computer screen and anyways like a different organism from myself. So I can only represent you in my mind. But this means that this like fundamental nature can be considered simply as the nature beyond our conscious models of the world in itself beyond our representations. And in mystical experience, one has met or seen or has become one with this ultimate nature. So yes, we are part of the ultimate nature of reality in this sense, because I am not myself, I'm not a model, I'm not a perception, I'm this here, this the concept of Zen, I mean, the concept of this I refer to Zen literature, where it has specific meaning. So I say that consciousness is part of the intrinsic nature of reality. This is part of reality in itself, this experience right here now. And then the content of the fundamental nature of reality is described in metaphors or simply as ineffable. So I would say that this or experience in itself is ineffable. I cannot describe what it's like to be me now or experience this talking here it's sort of private in this sense, especially if you haven't had similar experiences, then it would be difficult for you to understand. Of course, we can never know directly what it's like to be another person. And like all models of consciousness that I generate are distinct from consciousness itself. So I may conceptualize my consciousness in some ways, but these conceptualizations are distinct from my consciousness in itself, which is simply this process happening here right now. And then, of course, we have also this positive characterization like light, mind, or God. These can be also considered as models of the same reality. And if we consider them as the models of the same reality, the science models, then if they are compatible, then there is no conflict with naturalism here, because naturalism doesn't entail that the scientific model of reality would be the only correct model of reality. So what makes the psychedelic experience special? Here are some hypothetical answers to that. Maybe psychedelics relax beliefs and produce what could be called model collapse. This is central in the Rebus model. And this would enable that we become aware of our models as models. So when the reality melts in front of our eyes, we are very aware that this is just a model of the reality. We know, at least if we are not totally high, that the reality in itself, the reality has not melted. It's just my model of the reality. So we sort of come to see our models as models. And I would also say that psychedelics amplify this, or consciousness in itself, by showing its ineffable nature. Basically, all consciousness is ineffable, but in psychedelic experience, because we don't have concepts for that, so we are forced to see how consciousness is different from our conceptualizations and reflective models about that. And we see that this is reality here right now. So this is from, I don't, please shout out if I'm going over time. This is from a recent psilocybin study from our Danish colleagues, McCulloch et al. This is a report from the participant, the layperson. I think it is absurd that we try to examine this phenomenon. He's tripping in the scanner. That we are scanning my brain to figure out what's happening. I know that we can't understand it, that we can't put an equation on it and figure it out. I feel it is human arrogance trying to tame all the beauty. Scan me, then we won't get any closer to the truth. I think this is nice because it's from a lay person, nothing technical here. So the take-home message, I could talk hours about this, but consciousness shows the limits of science. When we know what consciousness is in itself, we come to realize that all models fail to capture what this is, this existence right now. And for science, the intrinsic nature, the nature beyond observations and scientific models, that is a mystery. We cannot know that, and science cannot tell what that is. Science is also in consciousness, representations. But I can know the intrinsic or model independent nature of my own consciousness. It is this here. And in this sense, consciousness affords us knowledge of the fundamental nature of reality all the time. And this is not specific to psychedelics. This is what Zen philosophy emphasizes. But psychedelics are special because they amplify consciousness, is what consciousness is in itself, and enable to see us to see beyond models. This is related to the reducing valve idea of psychedelics, that we come to see past our concepts, which sort of make everything dull. Our models that enable us to predict the world, they make also everything dull, and we fail to see the beauty of existence, like the beauty in the sound of the dishwasher, for example.
Amazing. Thank you both so much for this really, really interesting talk. I'll get stuck in straight away with just some questions that we've had. So starting off with a question for Chris. So when you were talking about the propositional knowledge, you spoke about false memories. Is there any way to test for false memories? Have any studies sort of been designed towards this, or just any way to assess for this?
Yeah, look, there's a huge literature on this, and it goes back to what's been called the memory wars of the 1990s, in which this whole sort of recovered memory phenomenon was quite big and was attracting a lot of interest and discussion. I don't know that literature very well, and that's one reason why I'm quite tentative about this whole issue at the moment. So, I mean, in some cases, there are ways, just ordinary mundane ways, you know, you can kind of talk to multiple other witnesses, or you can find factual evidence that just kind of contradicts the thing apparently being remembered. And there have been, you know, a number of cases in which it's been shown in that kind of way that apparent, and I'm not talking about psychedelics here, I'm talking about, you know, apparent recovered memories under hypnosis or in psychotherapy and this kind of thing. There have been a number of cases in which memories of that kind have been falsified in that sort of, you know, prosaic, mundane way, just by finding kind of records or factual information, or, you know, numerous witnesses about what was happening on the day in question, or where the person was, or whatever. So I don't know of anything more specific or more interesting than that, but again, this is not an area that I really know very well.
Okay, thank you. And sort of, I guess, to both of you guys, oh, sorry, I've just lost the question. What proportion of our understanding of the epistemological properties of psychedelics has come from modern investigations and research, and what has come from more historical use?
You want to go first, Jussi?
I don't know how to answer. I think the most important epistemological points about psychedelics, well, especially from the metaphysical perspective, they are not specific to psychedelics. Psychedelics are just chemicals. They are not like special. What is special is the type of consciousness that they produce. And people have been producing these kinds of states through meditation and other kinds of techniques throughout the ages. And what's important is how your consciousness changes. Maybe these more psychodynamic or therapy-related benefits are more from the Western, like modern science. But the metaphysical ones, I would like, comes from history.
Yeah, that's good. I don't have a lot to add to that, except to say that your answer is going to depend in a way on your substantive views about the epistemology of psychedelics, you know, because if you think that one of their epistemological properties is that they really do enable us to encounter the ultimate nature of reality or the spirit world or something like this, then you're going to say, well, those epistemological properties have been worked out by the long-standing traditions, you know, the kind of cultural and religious traditions that use psychedelics ceremonially. Whereas if you incline to my views and you think that, you know, their main epistemological properties have less to do with metaphysical knowledge and more to do with the more prosaic knowledge, then as Jussi suggested, you're likely to think that that's been charted more in the sort of recent era of psychedelic research.
Wonderful, thank you. Do either of you know any famous philosophers that you can name that have utilized psychedelics, and if and how it's shown up in their work?
Peter Sjöstedt. I think he's one of the rare examples who are quite open about their own experiences, because of course they must be open, because if you do philosophy based on a psychedelic induced mystical experience, then you cannot do it without the personal experience. So Sjöstedt has, for example, produced an article where he interprets the 5-MeO-DMT experience in terms of Spinoza's philosophy as amor Dei intellectualis, this like intellectual love of God, or like white light. Yes, Dr. Peter Sjöstedt. Yes. So that's a current figure. Aldous Huxley. Well, he's not a really he's sort of philosopher as well. Am I missing some, Chris?
Depending on how narrowly or broadly we construe psychedelics. I mean, William James, of course, wrote about his experiences on nitrous oxide, but not classic psychedelics. Yeah. And, you know, I mean, in Thomas Metzinger's work, I don't think there's ever kind of an explicit proclamation of having had psychedelic experiences, but Metzinger was one of the kind of first contemporary philosophers to really do philosophy of mind in a way that was seriously informed by, you know, a deep study of the psychedelic experience and other altered states of consciousness. Yeah, I mean, Peter Sjostet-Hughes actually has an essay about the psychedelic influence on Western philosophy, in which he catalogues various philosophers throughout the ages who, you know, he says there are evidence were, you know, took drugs or took psychedelics or were influenced by psychedelic experiences in one way or another.
Oh, great, thank you both. And just for anyone who's interested, we did actually have a talk last year's conference with Peter Hughes, and it's up on the Drug Science YouTube if anyone wants to have a look. A question specifically for Chris: how much can someone not having a direct psychedelic experience, say from indirect sources, know about the psychedelic experience really? Does this imply that only direct experiences can lend to significant transformation in psychedelic episteme?
Yeah, so I think the answer is they can know quite a lot, but the difference between book learning and having the experience yourself is qualitative rather than quantitative. It's not in a sense about how much you know, but what kind of knowledge you have. And this is exactly where I think something like knowledge by acquaintance comes into play, you know. I mean, you know, so if you imagine two hypothetical people and they both have read all the same books about psychedelics, they both have all the same propositional knowledge and whatever, and then one has had psychedelic experiences while the other one hasn't, then the one who's had the experiences is going to know more because, you know, they've got all the knowledge the other one has and then some. But yeah, I think one thing that is useful about these epistemological categories is they enable us to say relatively precisely what the distinction amounts to. You know, it's not necessarily a matter of knowing more versus knowing less, but it might be a matter of having, you know, indirect propositional knowledge, testimonial knowledge versus having knowledge by acquaintance of these effects. And I think this is an issue that comes up in relation to some of the points Jussi was making as well, you know, about Jackson's Mary's Room thought experiment. And, you know, there's been a lot of debate about what exactly that thought experiment shows. And one kind of idea is that, you know, it shows the limits of certain modes of communication, you know, the fact that reading about an experience can never be the experience and can never cause you to have the experience. So there is a kind of knowledge about experiences that one can only get by undergoing them. But then what that actually shows metaphysically, you know, the consequences of that for our ontology. I thought you were going to want to come in. The metaphysical consequences of that for what actually exists are another matter altogether.
Yeah, because you wouldn't know that subjective phenomenal consciousness exists at all unless you were yourself conscious, and that's a fact about the world. So therefore you get facts about the world through your own experience. I would say that what you call knowledge by acquaintance, that would give metaphysical knowledge about the reality, because experiences are part of the reality and you get acquainted with that part of reality. You know it more. Like, I would say that knowledge by acquaintance gives you knowledge of what things are in themselves, whereas science, like knowledge by description, only gives us, well, descriptions and models of the world. So it's deeper knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, I have some thoughts on this, but I'm not going to kind of reply, because then we'll just devolve into Chris and Jussi debate metaphysics and epistemology for the remaining 5 minutes, which would be fun. But
we have to do it sometime.
We do.
Yeah, I'm sure that everyone would love to hear that, but we do have a lot of questions. Just sort of on that same vein, Chris, you mentioned about Mary's Room on acid, this thought experiment. I was just wondering, Jussi, if you could just explain briefly a little bit more about this, just for our viewers that haven't heard of this before.
Sorry, what? Explain what?
You mentioned the Mary's Room on acid.
Yeah, Mary on acid. Yeah, exactly. It's on the book by Christine Hauskeller and Peter Sjostet-Hughes, which is from the Philosophy and Psychedelics Congress from last year, Exeter University. It's from on Bloomsbury. But the point is, well, it's a Zen philosophy motivated paper. It starts from the classical Mary thought experiment, but then turns to psychedelics because psychedelics are feasible. You can basically do it yourself. You can test it yourself. I don't recommend it to anybody, but you could in principle. So it's like less sci-fi thought experiment than the original one. But then it amplifies, the psychedelic experience amplifies certain aspects of consciousness, which I think also can shed light on the mind-body problem. But that's maybe difficult to summarize. It's mainly the same point as I made here.
Okay, thank you. And another question from one of our attendees. Can we say that this tension between naturalism and mysticism reflects how humans are capable of attending to the world in different ways, but that the left hemisphere's way seems much more obvious to us only because of our tendency to need and simplify and abstract for survival?
Yeah, absolutely. It has got to do with our survival. Like we have generative models of reality as in predictive coding, and these can be considered as the reducing valve in what Huxley had in Doors of Perception. And these doors become opened, or the reducing valve becomes opened when the models are loosened, as the Rebus model would say, that we come to experience one could say like the raw sensory data, the raw sensory input, or at least like more raw than we ordinarily have when we just conceptualize everything and see everything as familiar. So it has this like vast novelty aspect when we see beyond the models. And of course, yeah, it would not be good for our survival to be in this kind of psychedelic state all the time, because we need concepts to survive.
My position on that, for what it's worth, is that the tension between naturalism and mysticism is not wholly down to styles of thinking. You know, I think that the two can be reconciled to a surprisingly large degree. I think a lot of the kinds of insights that people seem to get in mystical experiences or mystical type experiences are things that are compatible with naturalism if you understand them properly. And so this is a point on which Jussi and I agree, but I think you know, we disagree about how many. You know, I sort of have a smaller circle around the kind of mystical insights that I think can be made compatible with the version of naturalism that I think is the right one. So yeah, there's work to be done there, but for my money, at least, there is at least some real conflict between some plausible versions of physicalism and some, you know, cosmic consciousness, you know. So when people kind of say that there really is a kind of universal mind or something underlying the universe, I mean, that definitely is incompatible with any kind of physicalist or materialist worldview.
It's not. If you consider it can be considered as a model of the same reality as science models, because you have to keep distinct. If you consider that spirit world to be separate from this world, then you would postulate dualism, and that contradicts naturalism on all definitions. If you postulate a theistic God that is transcendent and separate from this universe, then that contradicts naturalism. We agree on that, but I think that physicalism and idealism are completely compatible if both just agree that there are objects independently of any specific minds. When I close my eyes, the pencil continues to exist, but what is its nature outside my consciousness? That's the question. And you can say that it's physical or ideal or anything, but they are just concepts. So all we have is models of reality.
You can say it's non-mental. There's something you can say that has some definite content to it.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm really loving this back and forth between you two guys. Honestly, it's really, really lovely to listen to. I think we'll go on for a couple more minutes since we started a bit late. So one more question that I have here is, would a relational model of reality and consciousness help answer some of the questions on consciousness itself? I'm thinking of Karen Barrett's work here.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with his work, his or her work, but the relational model is important because it's also related to the experience of interconnectedness and related to the extended mind hypothesis that you are literally now in my consciousness. We form this interconnected causal process here. And on this view, everything is relations. And this is one problem with Russellian monism, which usually is this way to explain how science is ignorant about the world, because it commits to this kind of substance metaphysics where relations are always subordinate to things. So and this is, I think, in conflict with science as well, to postulate that if we have electrons and they are processes essentially, if you postulate that they also have some kind of intrinsic static essence, this categorical nature that underlies their dispositions, then I think you risk contradicting naturalism, and at least you postulate this kind of dualism. So relational thinking and process thinking, that everything is related and happening all the time, and there are not so much things but instead processes. So that's a much more plausible view, I think, and it's also resonates with the psychedelic insight about interconnectedness. I'm not sure if it helps to explain the problem of consciousness per se, but at least it's a plausible metaphysics.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of that. And for that reason, we should probably think that it doesn't help to solve the problem of consciousness, because we clearly have different views about that. But I think we can both sign up to something like a heavily relational view. I mean, I'm not familiar with the work of the person who was mentioned either, but there is a view in metaphysics and the philosophy of science. You know, there's a metaphysical scheme called ontic structural realism, which says basically that, you know, what reality is made of is not things but relations. You know, you go all the way down and you find that relations rather than things or objects are fundamental. And then of course you've got process metaphysics, which says that happenings are more fundamental than objects. And I don't have a particular strong view, but I think that these sorts of views in general are very plausible, and they're based on, you know, analyses of fundamental physics. And this is one of the, you know, it's far more than a grain of truth. This is one of the serious kind of nuggets of truth that I think there is in the mystical experience, even though I'm not an extended mind person actually. And I think the cosmic consciousness thing is wrong. This kind of, you know, anti-substantialist metaphysics where everything is processes or relations at bottom, I think is some of the real truth to be found in these experiences.
Thank you both. So just thinking more of answering these questions. So by answering the question of consciousness and what is consciousness and related to psychedelics, how can we, with this answer, how can we apply this to the more practical elements of psychedelics? So for example, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So what implications does understanding consciousness have on the applications of psychedelics?
Do you want to start, Chris?
Sure, yeah, I'll have a go. So understanding consciousness, I'm actually not sure if it has that many direct or practical applications. I mean, if we were to kind of somehow get really strong evidence that some particular theory of consciousness is the true one, you know, let's say I wake up tomorrow and I've finally got the knockdown argument that convinces everyone beyond all, or, you know, any shadow of a doubt that physicalism is true, then that might have some practical implications, I think, because then we could say very confidently, well, people are coming out of these experiences with false beliefs, and we need to kind of take steps to sort of prevent that outcome or mitigate that or something like this. Maybe we'd at least have to have a serious conversation about that. And maybe as well, I mean, I guess I can foresee a possibility down the track where if we had a fairly advanced empirical theory of consciousness, you know, a theory of the neural and cognitive mechanisms of consciousness, that might help us to sort of tailor psychedelic treatments. You know, if we had it could advance our understanding of how different sorts of setting and preparation lead to different kinds of experiences, and it could maybe help us to, you know, steer the experience in a more therapeutic direction. But my sort of third and I think most important point is that I think the epistemology of psychedelics in general, to my mind, is of more immediate and direct relevance to their therapeutic use than the debates over consciousness, because I think the sorts of knowledge acquisition that I was talking about, you know, the ones that aren't so much metaphysical and that are compatible with physicalism, I think there's a good case to be made that they are involved in the therapeutic mechanism, you know, that it's things like gaining these forms of knowledge by acquaintance with the potential of the mind and the constructed nature of the sense of self. And it ties into things Jussi was saying about, you know, we do come to see our models as models, and this can kind of loosen their grip on us. This can be very therapeutic if we're kind of able to step outside our models of ourselves as a suffering kind of hopeless person in depression or anxiety or addiction or whatever, and discover other models, other ways of seeing ourselves. So I think, you know, some of these epistemological concepts that don't tie directly into consciousness or metaphysics as such can help us to kind of refine and frame new hypotheses about the therapeutic mechanisms at play that then can be tested empirically and might help us to refine clinical practice.
I agree with much of that, or maybe even almost everything. But one thing that is often ignored is the role of worldviews and philosophical opinions in psychological well-being. So, for example, if one has this kind of Cartesian metaphysics where we are these like separate lost souls in this nasty, cold physical world, my hypothesis is that it would lead to feelings of alienation, in contrast to when you feel that everything is one and interconnected, or even this panpsychist idea, which I think is compatible with physicalism and naturalism, as Galen Strawson, for example, argues in much detail. If you have this panpsychist idea that everything is somehow conscious, there is this kind of like light that underlies the reality. That's positive. If you have that kind of, that we are just waves in this ocean, or like forms of this light, my hypothesis is that this would be related to positive well-being. But these are empirical questions. What Chris is focusing on is what is the epistemic status? Is this knowledge or not? And that's important. We don't want people to have delusional beliefs, but then it's an empirical question how these kinds of beliefs are related to well-being. There is, for example, evidence that religiousness and spirituality are protective for mental well-being, or protect from psychiatric problems. And that's important. Of course, we shouldn't like push any metaphysical or spiritual ideas to people, but if they find these themselves, and if they themselves consider them as true, then we as philosophers can like help them to find the right concepts, and for example to see that there is no conflict with the scientific worldview and certain kinds of spiritual ideas, so that they it would make their life easier.
Amazing. Thank you both for such a interesting little debate between you guys, and such a wonderful talk from you both. We've run over a little bit over time, but I think it was honestly so worth it. We're gonna stop now for a short break. Thank you again to both speakers. We will come back at 2:15. I can see that our next panelists have arrived, so the next talk will be the patient perspective. And yeah, thank you all again.